Hello and welcome to die cutting, cutting external threads using dies rather than the lathe. What you see in front of you is a range of different options that we can use for cutting an external thread. At the bottom here we have die nut. This is an industrial grade die nut. It has hexagonal sides on it, and that's ideally suited for cleaning, recutting and repairing damaged threads, as opposed to starting to cut a brand new thread from a piece of blank material. You can use it for that, it's not advised. This unit here is a very cheap example of a die cutting system. What we have here is something very similar to the hexagonal die nut, in that it has no breaks in it. It is a solid piece, and it has the thread formed inside. This one is an M6, so a common size thread, something that you're going to use quite a lot throughout your careers. This one again, ideally suited for cleaning threads, for repairing damaged threads. At a real push you can use it to cut a new thread. It's far from ideal. I would advise against it as much as possible. The reason these two are of no particular value for cutting new threads is because they are solid. So their size is fixed. There is no ability to adjust them at all. So that means when they actually start to cut the thread, the amount of force that's applied to each one of these teeth will be excessively high, and they can cause damage to the teeth. In fact, if you look at the back of this one, there's that side, you probably won't be able to see it, but there's some significant damage to the back of this, the teeth on this particular die nut here, where it's been used perhaps with excessive force. So these two good for cleaning up, but not particularly good for the task that you're about to undertake. This one, just as a useful aside, is from a super cheap set, the kind of thing that you'll find at book fairs and markets. Tap and die set, exceptionally low quality. They can afford to be low quality on these because they're solid, so they're inherently very strong. And they will get you out of trouble, but you won't use them professionally. That's the sort of thing you buy in a mad panic because you have to repair a thread. So I'm going to move these two to the side, concentrate on these two. So these are both exactly the same. We have a small hand version here and a larger one here. I'm going to show you using the large one just because it's a little bit more easy to see things because of its size, but as you can see, both exactly the same. They both have the split, which you might or might not be able to see at the top, and you'll see that a bit closer when I pull one out. This is nearer the size that you're likely to be using, sort of thing that will do anything from M4, M5 through to probably M8, and you'll go a little bit larger for M10, M12, etc, etc. So here is a rather large example of a die wrench, die holder, in conjunction with the die itself. So we have here, as you can see, 3 screws, which are tight. Just going to wind those out a little bit so we can remove the die. And in here, the die itself. This is actually quite a nice unit in that it's got a little adapter ring in here, so we can use this for even bigger dies. I can take this piece out if I wanted to, so I can put an even bigger die in there, and you have to put this ring in there just to make it small enough to accept the normal ones. Important things to note with the bolts: they're not standard bolts. If I wind this through far enough, you should just be able to make out that this is conical on the top, so it goes to a point, and each one of these bolts is exactly the same. It has a point on the end of them, and that's quite important. You can't just use a normal bolt. If you lose one of them, you'll have to remachine something to suit the application. So those conical points locate in the holes that we have on either side of the die, and also in the groove that we have on the top for the split. So you can see the groove that we've got there, clear, nice groove, taper on the sides so that that conical pin will locate in it. Other points to make out on here, this particular die, you can see the lettering on the top here, we have a lead in, so that's a chamfer on the top there, which makes sure that as it's applied to the rod, it won't experience too much loading on the teeth initially. The cutting starts nice and gradually. If you rotate it over to the other side, just see a little bit of damage on there where I've probably been a little bit too brutal with it. There is no lead in. So this side is not the side that you want approaching the work. You want all of the approach into the work to be done on that side with our nice lead in. So we take our holder, and when we install the die we need to make sure that that lead in is facing up. You see we've got a larger hole here, and if we flip it over we've got a smaller hole this side. So that means that the die will sit in, and all the time it's facing in that direction it won't fall out. So we can pop the die in, and then using the screws I'm just going to advance the middle screw till it makes contact, and you'll see it start to shift a bit. There we go. And then if I turn it a little bit more, what happens is that this die will expand out fractionally. We're not talking a great deal, but it will expand out and fill the void that we have there completely, and that will act to open up the teeth so that the space in between these teeth has been increased. So when we now start to cut with the die, it's going to be removing the least amount of material it possibly can while still effecting to cut a thread, and that's very important. That means that we're not going to try and rip the material out too heavily. We're going to take a reasonably light cut, which we can then use to recut again until we get it to an accurate size. So I've wound that in nice and tight, open the die nicely. You can, in most of these, just use a screwdriver to tweak it a little bit further. It's unlikely you'll go far enough to break it because it's held in the holder, unless you have a holder which is the wrong size. But there should be about a millimetre clearance all the way around when it's just installed lightly in there. You'll know if it's wrong because it'll be flopping around in there. So once we've done the centre screw up, I am going to advance these two screws down just to make contact with those little half holes that we have in the side of the die. That just pushes it down and makes sure it's nice and secure, but I'm only doing them very lightly, finger tight, just so that they're located in there. That die is now ready to start cutting a thread, and the application to the bar, obviously this is an undersized bar, this is M8, well this is 8mm I should say, bar size, so perfect for cutting an M8 bolt. But what we have here is we're going to have the lead in, and the open side of the die will attack the work in that direction, so that as we're applying force, the closed side on this side will prevent the die from slipping out. We'll then be able to work our way down, cutting our thread. Once we've gone as far as we need to go, we'll then wind it back up again, and then we'll try a nut on it. If we try the nut on it and we find that the nut is too tight, which it almost definitely will be with the die fully open, what we can then do is we can release a little tension, about a quarter of a turn on that central screw. Just nip these in, and you see I get about a quarter of a turn out of each of them, so it's closing that back up again, and then I can cut it again. Open it back up again, check, and if I still need to, if it's still too tight, again I'll you won't have it quite so easy as that, but it's very difficult for me to clamp this down and hold it in place whilst doing this, so much easier if I just show you the process with a preform thread. Okay, so we've got our thread. First thing that we've done is we've ground into it, like I've done here with this piece of M8 bar here. I've just ground or filed in a nice chamfer at the top, so we've got a nice progressive lead in for the threads to get started. If you try and get it lined up and located on a squared off thread, end of the bar, you're never going to get the thing started, and it'll be very difficult to proceed. So we've got a little chamfer on the end there. Going to apply a little bit of cutting compound, just the standard cutting compound that you keep in the cosh cupboard in the stores. So nicely on the shaft. We're also going to get some just applied inside the die itself, so we're well lubricated. Then it's simply a question of locating your die on top, and most critically ensuring that you get a nice 90-degree angle between the piece of rod that you're trying to cut the thread into and the actual tool itself. We cannot have the thread cut at an angle like so. You get about halfway down the die and it will just bind up and it will no longer go any further, and you end up breaking the die itself. So it's critical you start off nice and square. Now you can do this by eye, by looking, checking it from one side to the other, going round and round, even having a colleague look to actually see if it looks square. The better way of doing it is to utilise the machine that we've got in the stores, which is normally used for tapping, but you can actually use the little chuck that we have and rest it on the back of the die holder here, so that its weight is pushing down on it, and that will keep the whole thing lined up and nice and square. You'll see that when we go to use it in the workshop. Mehmet will give you instructions on its operation. Very straightforward to use, and it ensures that you're keeping everything in line. So once we've got it lined up, very slowly, just constantly keep watching. We're nice and perpendicular. We can start to form the thread, and initially, because we've got that nice lead in, it'll be very easy, and then it'll start to get a little bit harder, and we'll need to apply a little bit more force to get the actual die to start cutting material off. And you'll get to the point where it becomes quite stiff and you can't actually turn it any further without fear of breaking it. And at that point you just need to turn it back a quarter of a turn. Now what you'll feel is, as you turn it back a quarter of a turn, it will get very hard and then it will release a little bit, and that's the swarf and the bits of partially cut metal getting clipped out of the way by the teeth, cleared into the space between the cutters on the die, which will then enable you to carry on turning, and then you better keep working your way through. My normal procedure is a couple of turns in a clockwise direction to work the die down, and then just a quarter of a turn back to clean it, and then a couple more turns down, quarter of a turn back to clean, and carry on all the way down until you've got to the very bottom of the thread, the full depth that you need to go. Once you've done this, then you can wind it back up again, taking it off. Any swarf that you might have in between the teeth you can then clean out. Make sure it's nice and clean. If you need to, just reapply a little bit of roll coal into your partially formed threads. And then what we can do is we're just going to open that centre screw up a little bit. Quarter of a turn should be fine, and then just advance these two in about the same amount, and that will again close that die up just a little bit. Relocate on the threads, and then you'll start to feel it cutting a little bit more. Same procedure, couple of turns, quarter back, couple, quarter back. Sometimes you can go further than a couple of turns before you clear it by going backwards. Sometimes you only get one turn. It's going to depend upon the materials, it's going to depend upon how much is being cut by the teeth themselves. You'll start to get a feel for when it's getting a bit stiff and needs to be cleaned. So we work our way down through there like so. Remember, each time we're going to just stop, clean it up, and check. So I didn't show that before, but after the first cut, check to see if the nut fits. After the second cut, check to see if the nut fits. If you need to, do a third cut until you get the nut moving nice and freely and easily down the thread without too much wobble and play. Now if you're not sure how that feels, go to the stores and ask for an M10 bolt and a nut, and just put one on top of the other and see how it actually feels as the nut runs down the bolt, because that will give you an idea of the kind of clearances that you would expect to have on a standard nut and bolt. That's basically all there is to cutting a thread using a die. Fairly straightforward. A few pitfalls if you if you don't open the die up enough and you try and force it down fully closed, you will cause damage to the die and potentially damage to your work as well, which could possibly set you back a whole day if it's a complicated component. So take care with it, take it slowly, a little bit at a time, do it quarter of a turn on your centre screw, recut, check with a nut. If it needs more, another quarter of a turn, recut it, check again. You won't go far wrong. Yes, it might take you an extra 10 minutes to get it done, but it will be more accurate, and that's much better than overcutting it and ruining the whole job.